record. We are live on Facebook and we are recording, and my cat is meowing. Nice timing, Rumi. So welcome everyone to our next class of the Summer of Pod series. We're so excited to see all of you. Again, for many of you, it's been great to kind of develop a community with those of you that are participating both in the incubator and also in the Summer of Pod challenge to produce your show this summer, Safer at Home Podcasting Challenge. I would just like to real quick start by saying, will you wave if you are in our Women of Color podcast incubator, and we will cheer and applause and snap. Yay. So good to see all of you. And I am just excited to kick off this evening's event. Hopefully some of you got a chance to listen to Jenn's Work It talk before tonight. It's one of my favorite things I've listened to, and I just always have Jenn's voice in my head when I'm in certain moments thinking about how to create something. So it's an honor to have you here, Jenn. Kat's going to introduce you in just a moment. But I do just want to remind everyone that you can sign up at our House of Pod website for our Summer of Pod Challenge if you haven't already. And any show that is produced between July 1st and August 31st will be entered into a competition to win an annual membership at House of Pod. So that gets you 12 months of recording at our studio, and we'd love to have you. So we'll be continuing to send out tools and resources like this video to ensure that you have what you need to get a show launched during this summer. With that, Kat, I'll let you take it away.
Okay. Hey, everybody. Great job, Becca. This is, I think, starting the halfway point of the incubator. So amazing work to all of the cohort and everyone who's in the middle of launching their shows. Keep it going. I first met Jenn in 2017 because I was in the Work It session where she went into making Oprah behind the scenes. And I think it was one of the most inspiring talks about radio and making a thing I've ever seen because of its honesty and its clarity and its precision. Like, Jenn just crushed it in the talk. And then when I was fangirling her so hard, I saw her in the hallway and asked her if I could interview her. And it's the first ever like real official interview that I did with the recording equipment that I have today. So it's a huge honor to have Jenn, and not just because of my personal nostalgic and the impact that she's had on me, but also just the impact that she's had on the radio and podcasting world at large. Jenn started as a radio journalist in 1999 and has since gone on and done so much in the radio world. She produced a 2-hour midday show called Reset with Jenn White. She was also the host of Morning Shift. And then she went on to produce a number of pretty remarkable podcasts, including Making Oprah, Making Obama, and then 16 Shots. And that was a pretty powerful piece that looked at police violence and the shooting of Lanquin McDonald. So I highly recommend looking that up after this talk. Jenn also was the local host of All Things Considered at Michigan Radio, and now this week starting a new job at 1A. So this is a huge time for Jenn. We are so lucky to have her here with us today. I can't even begin to say that over and over again. And I'm going to turn it over to her. So maybe we'll just do like some wavy fingers to say thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, the Zoom applause.
Hi, everybody. It's good to see your faces. I wish we were doing this in person. That would be preferable, but such is life at the moment. Before we get started, just for the folks who are on the Zoom call who are brave enough to show their faces in this moment, just show of hands, who comes from what would be considered like a traditional radio or podcasting background? That's awesome. Okay. The reason I ask is because this is just context I always like to give people. When I started in public radio in '99, I didn't start as a journalist. I didn't start as a host. I started on the fundraising side of things. Michigan Radio, the station I started at in '99, I was in love with public radio, and they had a position open as a major gifts officer. And I was like, never hire me for that, but damn it, I don't work there. So I'm going to put my resume, I've got some fundraising experience. Let me see what happens. And I got the job. And so I actually learned about making radio by doing it. I learned by working side by side with people. I learned by spending time in the newsroom and reaching out to folks who were willing to mentor me. I learned by doing. So if you ever feel overwhelmed or that, like, oh, I don't have the right background to do this, don't be daunted at all. That's whatever traditional means, like throw it out the window and lean into, lean into your story, lean into your experience and what you can bring to it. I'm a big fan of the whole idea that tradition is overrated often. So just wanted to set that up as a foundational point for our talk today. So Rebecca is kind enough to run the screen for me because I couldn't get my screen share to work on Zoom. Oh, technology. So let's start with our first slide. Haha. And can we get it to a slideshow experience there? There we go. Awesome. Okay. Here we go. So one thing that I want to make sure is really clear is hosting these podcasts it was an incredible experience. And I always have to shout out the producer on this, Colin McNulty. He produced Making Oprah and Making Obama. And he's a real dream. And we spent a lot of time together in small rooms talking through this stuff. And that partnership was really amazing and a lot of fun. And I always have to shout him out when I'm talking about these podcasts because he's brilliant. If you ever get a chance to, corner him at an event or at a conference or something like that, take the opportunity to pick his brain. Colin McNulty, just got to shout him out. Okay, looks like it's still loading a bit, but while we're waiting, I can tell you that the reason, when we go back to when I started at WBEZ, that was back in 2016. And I came at a time when the station had just finished Serial. So that was sort of under their belt and they'd gotten a lot of attention for that podcast. They were trying to figure out, well, what's next? What else do we want to do? And we asked ourselves a couple of questions. First, what are the stories we can tell better than anybody else? And the stories we could tell better than anybody else were stories about Chicago. So it's like, okay, well then what are the core stories about Chicago that people, across the country, much less the world, we didn't know that was going to happen, but it did. What are the stories people would want to hear about Chicago? And so it just so happened that 2016, or at that point it was moving into 2017, the old Harpo Studios were being torn down. And so there was a lot of talk in the news about, it's finally the true end of the Oprah era. And, it's the end of a television era. And we're like, wait a second, this is really a Chicago story. Even though Oprah isn't from Chicago, what she built and the impact it had on television as a whole, that happened here. And that's a story worth telling. And so that was the original spark for the idea. It was this convergence of, saying goodbye to something, us understanding that we had an opportunity to tell a specifically Chicago story and feeling like, hey, we want to do it. So let's try it. Let's click to the next slide. So the production process was pretty long, or it felt long, at least for us. And maybe in retrospect, it wasn't that long, but at the time, it felt like it was a lifetime. So we started in mid-July of that year. And it started with really, reaching out to people who were still in Chicago. One of the benefits of starting with this show, with the Oprah Winfrey Show, was that a lot of the producers were actually still in the area, or people knew them, or we were able to get access to them because they still had some connection to the show and to the city. And so that was like the first steps we took. It's like, okay, who are those sort of first level producers we want to reach out to, and the executive producer, who's still here, who can we get in the studio, who needs to be, on an ISDN, and sort of like putting those pieces together. We started editing in mid-August. Now, in both the Oprah Winfrey podcast and in Making Obama, both of those interviews, the key interviews, Oprah and Obama, actually came very late in the production process, much later than we would have wanted. Obama came even later than Oprah's did. But for Oprah, we had our first interview with her on August 29th. So we were well into the editing process. And then we had to go back and integrate her voice in. And then we continue to edit. We sent the podcast out to some trusted folks, some This American Life producers, some folks from Curious City, if you're familiar with that show and podcast, to get feedback. Then we went back into the editing process to do the sort of like final tightening up of it. And then finally it was released on November 10th. There were those 3 episodes, the 10th, the 17th, and the 22nd. And part of the reason we released it on those successive weeks was that we wanted it to be out in its entirety by Thanksgiving, with the thought that people would be doing a lot of driving and would want something to listen to. And, what better to binge on than a 3-hour podcast about Oprah. So that was our overall approach. Okay, next slide. Please take notes if you have questions, because of course we'll have some time for Q&A. So when we finished Oprah, the transition from Oprah to Obama was like, okay, we told this quintessential Chicago story. Who else has that same appeal? Who else would people be interested in? And specifically went to Obama. Again, not someone who was born in Chicago, but someone who created a significant political moment, in this case, in Chicago. His political career was really shaped in the city. So that's why we thought, okay, this is a logical next step. And something that we were able to do with that podcast that we weren't able to do quite as much with Making Oprah was really set Chicago out as a character. For folks who are less familiar with Chicago politics, it's a whole thing. It's a bit of an adventure. And so Making Obama really allowed us to give people some insight into Chicago politics, some of the history around the city, and really, again, shape Chicago as a character in and of itself. So when you listen to Making Oprah and you listen to Making Obama, they're very different podcasts in terms of sound and tone. A lot of that had to do with the subject. We're talking about a political figure as compared to someone who's more of a cultural figure. And so there's maybe a little more gravitas in Making Obama than there was in Making Oprah. The Making Oprah story was also very personal for me. But because Obama's a political figure, we had to put a little more distance there, a little more space. So those were the main differences between the two, but the connection between the two podcasts was that Chicago tie. And again, it was a story we could tell well because we were in Chicago and a lot of the key players were still there as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is an example of some of the earliest iterations of the podcast and how we were thinking about shaping it. This is a dry erase brainstorm board for Making Oprah. And if you look at the very top, you can see a few things like, okay, September 8th, that was the anniversary that the show went on the air. Okay, so maybe that's a peg. What are the ways we want to present this podcast? Yes, we want to do a podcast, but is there also opportunity for a radio special? We started that the thinking around the different platforms it could be presented on very early in the process so that we would have that in the back of our heads. If you look down in the lower right-hand corner, you see some of the very bad title ideas that we threw around. The Oprah City, Harponians, Opropolis. That one got shut down pretty quickly, but it did, come up as something we could talk about and laugh about. Live Your Best Life, that's another one. And then if you look to the left again, you can see some of the ways we were thinking about how we wanted to shape the story, because what we were really clear about with making Oprah from the beginning was that it wasn't a podcast about her. It was really a podcast about how she, along with this starting off small, scrappy group of producers, created the show itself and how that show reshaped daytime television. So it's not a biography of her, it's an oral history of the show. And so we were very clear on that from the beginning, and using that as sort of a touchstone for the podcast as we continued through the interview and editing process, being able to return to that, it kept it very focused. And granted, in the podcast, Oprah's a central character because who better to tell the story than her? But if you notice, we don't really get a lot into her personal life. We're not talking about Stedman. We're not talking about her family history or anything. It's very focused on the show and how they built the show. And a lot of that thinking was born out of those early brainstorm exercises. So I know you all are well into, many folks are well into your production process at the point, but when you're thinking about the thing you're creating, having that touchstone idea that you can always come back to as a gut check for whether or not you're getting unfocused, whether you're staying, really on the path that you set for yourself. It's really good to have that central idea, that central question that you're trying to answer. And for making Oprah, it was, how did they make the show? Simple. It's very simple. But if you aren't answering that question, or if you take a path that diverges a little bit, but it doesn't lead back to that question, you really have to think actively about whether you're following the right path or if you're going a little astray. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So this is just sort of the project structure and how we were setting deadlines for ourselves. Deadlines are rough, y'all, I understand, but I strongly encourage you to set them for yourselves if you can. Now, I cannot say that we stuck to this. I mean, we hit every release date deadline, but did edit 2 actually happen on October 7th? I don't remember anymore. And I think that when we get to like the mix and the final edit, there's probably a little bit of squishiness in there near the end. But having these goalposts for ourselves helped us not end up in a complete crunch by the end. I mean, it was still tight. I'm sure Colin, in his memory, would say that he was ready to run out of the studio screaming on several occasions, and out of the editing booth screaming on several occasions. But I think it is important to create a calendar for yourself. You have a structure. And when you're working independently, it can be challenging to really set an end date for your look. This is when I'm going to be done. But the thing that I notice about podcasts that's different from live radio, with live radio, when it's done, it's just there. It's just gone out into the world. You can't pull it back. It's over. And with podcasts, you can massage thing to death. And I think setting those strong deadlines for yourself and saying, no, there has to be an end. There has to be an end. That's really important. That's really important. You can overwork something. So think about how you're setting deadlines for yourself, how you are, setting maybe that first edit date where you're like, okay, this is when I'm going to take my hands off of it and maybe hand it over to some trusted ears and get some feedback. but make sure you're giving yourself an endpoint, or else sometimes, I mean, these things just never, they will never get done. You'll never be able to take your hands off of it. Okay. Next slide, please. All right, this was the fun part. So this is an exercise that I think Colin actually introduced this for us. So what you see here are 3 giant white sticky sheets, all right, it's on the board. And then each episode is labeled. And then each of the yellow sticky notes represents a beat in that episode. And I wish I could zoom in a little bit more. If you were able to, look in a little closer, and maybe we can, what you'll see is like, okay, intro, that's going to be about, Oprah coming from Baltimore. And then that second sticky note is going to be, her interview process, how she got the job. And then the third, so each beat is represented on a sticky note. By doing that, what we did is sort of like lay out the flow of the episode, sometimes making notes of specific interviews that we knew needed to be included in that beat. And then we took a step back and looked at whether or not the narrative flow actually made sense. And sometimes it didn't. And so then you can just rip off the sticky note and say, actually, this makes more sense if it's over here. And then we shift this other thing. So it becomes a sort of living document that you can treat sort of like a puzzle, moving the pieces around until they actually have a narrative flow that works. And it's not to say that this is a fixed a fixed document, but what it does is it provides some guidance as you're going into your, if you're still doing interviews, if you, go into this and you say, I really think this issue is important, or we've got to answer this question, but it's the person we need to talk to answer this question. It makes it very clear what you have and what you don't have, what you still need. I highly recommend using this process. We used it in Making Oprah, we used it in Making Obama, we used it in 16 Shots, and it really helps clarify the story that you're trying to tell. And again, if you're still in the process of collecting tape, what you have and what you don't have, what you might still need. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. So this is the same exercise, but this time for Making Obama. So you can see here in episode 4, that's well, actually, let's look at the one to your left. So Act 1, we've got, okay, Rahm Emanuel, we know we've got that interview, and he talks about what it takes to get elected. Okay, we need to do the recap. So what we do is like, hey, last time we talked about this thing, this is what's coming up this episode. We know we want to do Michelle Obama's story. So it just sort of lays out the flow of it. And you'll see like there, it says Obama wedding. And it's got another little sticky note there about Hyde Park. And so that's a question about how much you need to explain to people who are unfamiliar with Chicago, what Hyde Park is, how it fits into the political environment of Chicago. How much context do we need to build in? So again, just this really clear visual representation of the story you're trying to tell, what you have and what you still need to get. Okay, next slide, please. So at BEZ, we used an editing software called Vegas. It's actually for film editing, but we just use the audio side of it. So this is just like what episode 1 of Making Oprah looked like from when Colin was doing all of his magic. It may not mean anything to you if you're still getting accustomed to editing, but I don't know, it looks sort of like an abstract painting, and it's always fun to see all the different layers. So if you're looking here, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I think 8 different tracks of audio that are woven together. Some of them are music, some are sound effects, some are interviews that are, woven together. But this is just, episode 1 of making Oprah as an audio file. Okay, next slide, please. So the Oprah interviews. So this is really a lesson in tenacity, and this holds true for both Oprah and for Obama. The smiling guy on the right, that's Colin. That's my buddy Colin. Colin did something really smart. At the beginning of producing the podcast, he reached out to Oprah's camp early on and said, hey, we're doing this podcast. We'd really love for her to be a part of it. And they were like, oh, that's great. Congratulations. Have fun with that. But he didn't take that as a no. He heard that as there's a possibility. And over the course of producing the podcast, he stayed in contact with her camp. And he would say, hey, we got this executive producer who's doing an interview, and we got this producer who's doing an interview. The only voice that's missing is Oprah's. And he never stopped communicating with her camp. And while we were in the process of doing the interviews with people, some of them who still had connections to her, we said, hey, put in a good word for us. Tell her what we're trying to do. We really want her to be a part of the conversation. And so again, when we got into the back end of production, we finally get this call that, yes, she's going to do the podcast. She'll do the interview with us. And so we flew out to LA, and we were scheduled to have about 45 minutes with her. And we were at the Ellen show, the Ellen DeGeneres show, backstage in a green room. And she came in and sat down and started rearranging microphones because she was like, your sound's going to be terrible. And we were like, all right, Oprah's rearranging mics. Let me just take a step back and let her do what she's doing. But that 45-minute interview ended up being an hour and 15 minutes. And then at the end of that interview, she said, I see what you're trying to do. You need more time. So call my people again and let's set up another interview. And so what started off as 45 minutes of tape actually turned into, I think we ended up with around 2.5 hours of tape with her that just made the whole thing so much richer. I think a lot had to do with Colin's tenacity and the way he stayed in contact with the camp and just explained to them, like, we're not doing a hack job on this. We're being deliberate and detailed, and we're talking to these important people who are part of what she built. Why would she not want to be a voice in the story that she's so central to? And I think a lot of our landing that interview had to do with that tenacity, but I also think she knew what we were building, and it was clear because of the information we continued to share, that Colin continued to share with their camp. So that was the experience with that interview. Can you go to the next slide, please? So very similar situation with the Obama interview. We got the interview with him at the 11th hour. We were deep into the editing process. We had already, I won't say we'd given up, but we had resigned ourselves to the idea that it just wasn't going to be a part of the documentary. And then we get the call, yes, he'll do it. You've got to come to DC to do the interview there. And we flew out, but because we were so deep into the editing project and the editing process, deeper than we were with making Oprah, we had to make this sort of strategic decision about, rather than trying to do a wide-ranging interview with him, because I think this was a case where they told us like 50 minutes. We believed them when they said 50 minutes. We're not going to get 2.5 hours with him. They mean 50 minutes. So we had to figure out where in the podcast series we really needed his voice. Where were the places we needed to plug him in to connect the dots more clearly, more fully than was a witness to what happened, more than they could do. And so we got into a room, Colin, me, a few other people from the station, and we really strategized a list of questions that were specifically geared towards getting answers to questions specific places in the podcast. And I remember being in a session and said, hey, would you ever release the video from the Obama interview? And I said, no, because it wouldn't sound like an interview where there was the same kind of narrative arc as what I would normally do, because we had to be so strategic with the time, knowing that we really were going to have this one shot with him. But again, this was a case of tenacity and Colin continuing to stay in contact with the Obama camp and making sure they knew what we were doing and working some of the relationships we had. And, you know, as we're doing interviews with people who were close to him, saying, hey, put in a good word for us. It also didn't hurt that when Obama was a state senator, he'd actually been on WBEZ talking about constitutional law. So he was familiar with the station and familiar with public radio. So that certainly didn't hurt our case. It only helped it. But again, getting back to that issue of tenacity. But it was just it's very interesting how different interview experiences were, because with Oprah, we really had a chance to sort of talk to her from beginning to end about creating the Oprah Winfrey Show. And with Obama, it was really about getting these very detailed, specific questions that we could edit into the podcast. Here's where we really needed it. Next screen, please. Okay. I wanted to get into some tips for just interviewing. These are things that I think as you're producing your podcasts, and we'll have a chance for folks who are in the incubator to listen to some of the work tomorrow. But for anyone who's tuned in right now and, you know, thinking about crafting interview and getting what you need for your podcast, these are just some basic tips that I carry in the room with me every single time. The first one, and I think it's obvious, but it's also easy to forget, especially if you're doing an interview where you feel a lot of pressure, or you maybe feel like you're not as prepared as you want to be. Active listening is the best tool, other than research or along with research, that you can bring into an interview. And there's a real difference between listening, which you'll be doing anyway, versus active listening. You will sometimes walk into a conversation with a list of questions that you need answers to, but you're so busy thinking about the next question you have to ask on your list that you're not really tuned in to what the person is saying. And it's in those moments when you're leaning in and listening that you might have the opportunity to have that person open up about something that you didn't even know you needed to hear. You end up with these magical pieces of tape, these magical moments, because you just followed the thread of the conversation that was happening in front of you, and not the thread of the conversation that you had planned. And that's two really different things. In the Obama interview, because we were so limited in our time and we knew specifically what we needed, I had less opportunity for that. But in the Oprah interview, we had this long list of questions, but once she started talking, my gosh, it was like, wait, what was that thing? And what was that thing? And I think being able to lean into the active listening and really following her as she was telling the story, that's another reason why we were able to get so much tape from her, because she's a storyteller and she was in her element. And when she started telling the story, she kept going. So when you're going into interviews, really have in your mind, listen for those opportunities where you can allow someone to give you more insight than you anticipated, where you can get more vulnerability or more openness, because as much as you will prepare what you want to ask, people come into the room, they come into the conversation with things that you could never be prepared for. So you just have to listen. You have to listen and respond to what's happening in the moment. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is a silly one, but also it really matters. I'm sure we've all heard conversations where the person interviewing wasn't really asking questions. Instead, they were making a series of statements and then expecting the person who they're interviewing to sort of fill in whatever blank was left. When you're crafting an interview, when you're preparing for an interview, and it's, again, it sounds silly, but actually look at your punctuation. Are there question marks there? Are you, and then waiting to see what the other person does? And say things out loud when you're writing your interviews and you're preparing. Say it out loud and ask yourself, wow, was there really a question there? Or am I just asking them to confirm something I already believe to be true? It's sometimes harder to craft a question than it is to just make a statement. But if you're interviewing someone, you're there to ask questions. That's what you're there to do. So it's a little thing, but it can make a big difference in how an interview actually turns out. Next slide, please. So, a lot of times I get questions about what's it like to, interview a former president or interview, Oprah Winfrey, a big cultural icon. And the thing that I want to encourage you to do is to always remember that you are talking to a person. You're not talking really to the position, you're talking to a person. Now, they may be in a position of power, and that should be acknowledged and respected if that's appropriate, or there should be, the way you craft the interview should definitely you should be aware of the position the person holds. But if you talk to the position and not the person, some of the humanity that can make an interview really come alive disappears. If you, as the person doing the interview, can't be cowed by the position, you gotta remember that no matter what their title is, there's a person sitting across from you, and that's who you speak to. I know it's a little nuanced, but I hope that makes sense. Try to carry that in the room with you whenever you're doing an interview. Next slide, please. And this is another thing, again, it comes back to that balance between being prepared, but also allowing space for discovery, for surprise, for emotion. There are moments when interviews get uncomfortable, where there will be a long pause. There's magic in those pauses. Like, there's so much that we hear in that silence. Don't feel the rush to fill that space. If you ask the question and someone goes still, just wait and see what happens. If they come back and say, can you ask that? I don't quite understand your question. Okay, that's fine. Reframes the question. But if they're sitting with it for a moment, if they give a heavy sigh, or you see them getting emotional, just let it be. Just let it be. I think a lot of times humanly we feel the need to sort of rush in, right? And make things comfortable again. But those moments are moments when, again, that humanity really has space to breathe. So let it happen. Let it happen. And if you're worried about, the silence, or you see someone getting emotional, you can acknowledge the emotion, say, I see that makes you emotional. And just let it breathe. Don't be afraid of those moments, even though they're uncomfortable for you. Just let it happen. Next slide. So we're in a time right now where I think a lot of what people expect in media are places where, or times when the host or the producer, if you have a voice in the podcast, or even editorially, where the biggest personality in the room. And if you are present in your podcast, if you are your voice is there, be present, but try not to center yourself. This was a really delicate line for us in making Oprah, because we wanted my sort of enthusiasm about Oprah and the importance of her and representation to be a part of the podcast. But it was important to me that the podcast wasn't about me, in the same way that the podcast wasn't about her. It was about how, again, getting back to that core question, how this group of producers made a thing. And so we don't really get deep into the sort of personal connection that I have to the story until the third episode. And we were constantly gut checking throughout the editorial process around where I was too present, or whether there was too much of me, and when we needed to pull it back. Because again, it was not a podcast about me. It wasn't a podcast about Oprah. We had to always go back to that central question: how did they make this thing? So if you are sort of grappling with that in your own production process, this is, again, a really good place to have that central question, that touchstone question to go back to say, is this moment in the podcast, is this path, this story, is it answering that central question? And if it's not, why am I centered in this moment if it's not answering that central question? Okay. Next slide, please. And this is another one. I mean, it's one of the joys about podcasting and creating this kind of work is that you get to go down this wonderful path of discovery. And sometimes when you're in an interview, you may find yourself feeling like, oh, I don't know the answer to this. Or sometimes an interviewee will say, well, do you know? Blah, 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 blah. If the answer is no, say you don't know. And you know what? It's okay. It's okay not to know. Because for people who are listening, that moment of vulnerability on your part, that moment of being willing to learn in the moment along with the listener, that's amazing. That's amazing. And it leaves space for them not to feel weird about not knowing. If you don't know, say you don't know, and it's okay. I think when we're producing things like this, we feel this need to be an expert on everything. But if you're truly the stand-in for the person who's listening, it kind of robs them and robs you of going on that journey of discovery together. If you know everything, why are you interviewing anybody about anything? Because you already know it. So you get to go on that path together and just really settle into that. Look, it's okay. It's okay not to know every single thing. All right, next slide, please. Really basics, and I'm assuming everybody who's tuning in already knows this, but the 3 B's: be professional, be on time, be respectful. And when I say time, I actually mean be early, because so often, you get on time, but you still got to set stuff up and things go south and you can't find parking and, all of the little things that can go left. Give yourself more time than you think you need. And when I talk about being professional, that's got everything to do with just being prepared. When we go into interviews, when we're asked people to share stories with us, they need to trust us. Like, a lot of times we go into these conversations and people are going to be sharing things that maybe aren't even comfortable. They need to trust us. And part of that trust comes from feeling like this is a person who is competent, who is prepared, and who is, ready, who's ready for this conversation. So you should always walk into the room with that. And respect is just a part of that as well. Thank people for their time. Just a simple thank you. Thank you for spending this time with me. I appreciate it. Just little things like that. Don't take it for granted that anybody has to speak to us about anything. They don't. But when they do, and when you have the opportunity to help them tell their story, that is a gift. And it's something we should really, really be respectful of. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, that was it. And I have no idea what time it is, but I think we're pretty much on time. Okay, so now we can do questions. If folks have questions, I am happy. And I'm not sure exactly how will it be in the chat?
I'm sure I understand.
Well, I didn't ask you anything, Siri, so that's okay.
You're not sure, which is Siri's like, let me help.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you. Let's give a round of applause. That was
Yay.
wonderful. Oh my goodness, so many gems.
I hope it was helpful.
Yeah, of course. Oh my gosh, so many things. I know our incubatees are nodding because so many things that are right on time for this program. Cool. Well, go ahead and raise your hand or put a note in the chat if you have a question. And all right, Suzanne, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you. First of all, thanks so much. I really appreciate your time. And as far as I was going to ask you how you scored President Obama and then Oprah, but you kind of elaborated that. So I'll skip to my next questions. But how do you build an audience is one question. And kind of related to that, how to get a celebrity or Instagrammer is one of those that has a huge following. I know with your President Obama and Oprah, you kind of had Colin going after them, but how would you, if you were someone that didn't have connections or producer, how would you go after those? And then the last question I had, did you test your shows as far as, did you prep the interviewee before you interview them, with some questions?
Okay, so I'll start with let's start from the first question, which was about growing audience, right?
Right. Uh-huh.
So I know I believe most of you are independent
Yes.
producers. Okay, so we were in a slightly different situation, which because we had a station behind us. But a few of the things that they used were really careful placement with podcasts that would have an audience that seemed like it would be a good crossover audience. So in terms of like placing ads on This American Life, which is a very story-based podcast, a lot of affinity there with the people who would typically listen to something like Making Oprah or Making Obama. Same thing like Snap Judgment. So I think if you can look at podcasts that maybe have what seems like some crossover audience, and see if there are ways to connect with those podcasts, to do ad placement if you have the dollars, or even if it's just like, if they have an interview podcast, because I'm not familiar with what everybody's doing, but is there a way for you to get some sort of placement or connection with that podcast so that they introduce their audience to what you're doing, and sort of like, is there some crossover opportunity there so you can build that way. And then, social media is it's a good tool. We were really fortunate in that the podcast The Read, which for some reason, Crystal, one of the hosts, fell in love with Making Oprah. And their audience is, I would say, predominantly young, Black and other people of color, queer, and pretty far outside the typical public radio demographic, especially in terms of age. But Crystal, not because we asked her to, but just because she loved the podcast, talked about it on their podcast a lot. And we got this whole other range of listeners that we wouldn't have reached through typical public radio avenues. Go figure, like, who knew? But I was so grateful. Another person, Saeed Jones, who is a poet, but at the time he was hosting AM to DM on BuzzFeed. It was BuzzFeed's morning show that they streamed on Twitter every day. And Saeed also fell in love with the podcast. Again, we didn't know anything about people doing that. He just started talking about it. And again, a similar thing where he brought in a whole swath of listeners who we probably wouldn't have reached through typical avenues. So that was unplanned, but I think there are opportunities for you to be deliberate about making those connections, and trying to even tapping into people who are working on podcasts in this group to figure out, okay, like, I know there may be some overlap in the audiences we're reaching out to. Where can we work together to build audience for one another? That was your first question. What was the second one?
It was, well, there was, you kind of hit a twofer. You got the build the audience, and then did you test the podcast? And then the last question was, did you prep the interviewee?
So testing the podcast, we had listening sessions. So we would pull people into an editing suite, folks who were not working on the podcast, who were just coming, like folks from the newsroom, and have them listen to it. And they would take notes. And then at the end, we would ask them questions like, okay, did you lose the story at any point? Did it get boring? Was there a hole somewhere where you feel like there's a dot that needs to be connected? And we would go through that process with a group of probably maybe somewhere between 4 to 6 people who were just fresh ears on it. Take that feedback and say, okay, so that was the testing we did. And again, we also sent it to those producers from like This American Life and Curious City to have them put ears on it and to say, hey, give us some feedback. What do you think? Is it lagging in certain places? Is the energy we want there? So again, I think that's a really good place for this cohort to tap into one another's expertise and ears and serve as that sounding board for one another. And then in terms of prepping interviewees, Colin would do pre-interviews with them, just in part to get a gauge for what they could actually talk about.
Uh-huh.
But we never give people like a list of questions. That's not something we do. We'll say, hey, this is the scope of this, get a gauge for what they might be able to talk about, where they might not be as great.
Mhm.
Also get a sense for what kind of talker they are. Are they a long
Mhm.
talker?
Yeah.
Are they going to give you those like
Yeah.
really quick, short bullet answers? And then that also, knowing that helps you craft the
Mhm.
questions you want to ask them for the actual interview.
Thank you so much. I really
You're
appreciate it.
welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thanks for those questions, Suzanne. And
Yeah.
as we plugged on our last class, we will have a Women in Podcast and Radio Happy Hour in August. So that's a great place to bring some stuff and we'll workshop with you.
Thank you.
What other questions? I have one in the chat, unless anyone's shooting a hand up. Okay, so it looks like the one in the chat says, what did Oprah and respectively Obama think of the show? What was that a consideration when you were producing it, and how much did you share with them?
I have no idea. I don't know if they listened to it. I could not begin to tell you. And honestly, their reactions to it were the farthest thing from my mind. For me, whether it's this or hosting 1A or whatever I'm doing, this work is for me, it's an act of service for the people who are listening. And so it's a lot less about, I want the people who I'm talking to have a positive experience. Sometimes it doesn't happen if it's a politician and you can't do anything about it, whatever. That's also my job. It's like, I'm not here to make you feel good, sir. But it's really more about people who are listening to, learn and understand the story we're trying to tell. It's about the act of service for them. So I don't know. I don't know if they ever listened, and I'm okay with some mystery. I like a little mystery in my life.
That's great. Did not expect that answer. Nikki, jump on in.
Hey, Jen, thanks so much. This was such a great conversation. I definitely appreciated your timeline as well. That was really useful to really see how you broke down the show. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the idea that you just didn't know if you were going to get the interviews? Like, how much did that, when you were first outlining the show and you had those beats, how much did that play a role in what you were going to create? And then how much did it change when you knew that you were getting the interviews, especially for the Obama one, when it was really late in the process?
So we worked from the assumption, once we got the first either, no or meh, we had to work from the assumption that we were not going to get them. So it was like, okay, regardless of whether or not we get these interviews, we are making these podcasts. Full stop. This is happening. Train's on the track. It's moving forward, period. And we were working from that assumption and building something that didn't rely on those voices. So when we got the Oprah interview, for instance, we just got so much more tape with her, and we weren't as far into the editing process as we were with making Obama. When that interview came through, we were really able to weave her through the whole thing. Again, with Obama, we would have had, the podcast would have been there, like regardless of whether or not he came in. And fortunately with him, there was other tape. There was the audiobook, his voice, from the audiobook reading things. There were other interviews that we were able to pull. And we had really great characters from his early political days in Chicago. So it would have been, it would have worked even without him, but having his voice at those key moments made it better. So I think that if you're building something and there are like interviews you really, really want, but you don't know if you're going to get them, try to work from the idea, how do I build this if this doesn't happen? It sounds a little fatalistic, but it will be easier to fit them in than it will be for you to try to backfill gaps that you left for a voice you thought you were going to have. Does that make sense? That will be a
Yeah.
harder process. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, because
absolutely.
it's
Thank
easy,
you.
it's easier to cut things, because like if you get for instance, like if we have a producer who talks about the, you get a car episode of making Oprah, telling that story, but then we get Oprah telling it, we can cut the producer and put her in, right? So that like, it's like yeah, we've got somebody telling that story, but it's so much better when this other person tells it. But try to work from, it's like the one place where I think it's like okay to work from a deficit model, even though that sounds negative, and I don't mean it in a negative way. People work from this assumption, we assume I'm not going to have this. How do I build this story in a way that's effective without that voice?
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, who else has questions? Bo, hop on in.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay.
Uh-huh.
So I actually have a question, a follow-up with Nikki about the structure. So when you're working with a docu-series, which is what I'm working on, how do you determine what's an appropriate length of time for each episode? I noticed you had 3 episodes, but that's such a huge story. And I was just curious, how did you determine what was an appropriate length for those episodes?
So it's interesting, if you look back at making Oprah and making Obama, the episode lengths varied between the 2 series. The Oprah podcast ended up being 3 roughly hour, I think. Y'all, it's been so long. Forgive me, but I think they were close to an hour-long episodes, like 3 of those. The Obama episodes were shorter, but there were more of them. I think some of what you have to figure out is the pace of the story, right? Like I'm always loath to say this is the right length, because I really do think it depends on the pace of the story and where those natural breaks. Because you're in a podcast, and if you're doing a docu-series, it's not like a sitcom where it's got to be 30 minutes with this length break. You have a lot of creativity and a lot of flexibility, because you're not locked into some of the same structures that you would be if it was airing live on radio, or if it was, a television series. So I think the core question you need to ask yourself is what does this chapter require? I wouldn't necessarily recommend, a 2-hour episode, because I don't think people really listen that way. You know what I mean? You got to kind of think about like, okay, somebody's commuting in their car or they're jogging, or like, how are people listening? But to my mind, and there may be people who disagree with me, the difference between an episode that's 28 minutes long and 35 minutes long is negligible. Like it's if the story requires a few more minutes, give it those extra minutes, so that you are wrapping a chapter in a place that feels right and organic, rather than trying to lock yourself. It's got to be 28 minutes. That's my thinking. I know some people think there's some magic length, but some of the podcasts that I listen to, The Read being one of them, Lord, some of their episodes are like an hour and 45 minutes, and another one to be Karen knows, it's like all over the place. And I listen to it, and I'm just like, it is what it is, and I just kind of roll with it. So yeah, so really I think pay more attention to what the story requires, rather than because I don't, with podcasts, I don't, so much of I think some of the early thinking around podcasts was related to how people thought about radio, and some of the rules that came out of radio sort of migrated into podcasts. And I don't know, and I don't know that people listen to podcasts in that way. Like, yeah, 5 a.m. I'm expecting to hear the morning edition theme song, because that's what's supposed to happen at 5 a.m. I start listening to a podcast at 2:08 in the afternoon, and it ends when it ends. You know what I mean? So the rules are not, they're not it's not an apples to apple thing. So think more about the flow of your story and and where the natural transition is for the next chapter, rather than trying to lock yourself into something that's artificial. And then use the editing process, right? The times when you let other people listen to the work to figure out that if it's 45 minutes, does it really need to be 45 minutes? You know what I mean? And not because it's too long, but because the story just may be moving too slowly. Because there may be some places where you can edit and make it more crisp and make the pace more listenable. But that's just, again, about the story itself. It's so weird how we look at like the picture, and looks like I'm looking off into the universe somewhere. I should be looking here. It's so weird. Oh, Zoom. Okay.
Yes, it's so funky. I have a question. Oh, Karen, you first.
All right, thanks. Thanks so much for being here. It's been really interesting and exciting to hear. I'm really curious about when you talk about how you made Chicago a character. I'd love to hear more about how you did that and suggestions that you have about making other places and things characters meaningfully and engagingly.
Yeah, I mean, Chicago in some ways was kind of easy because people, Chicagoans they are Chicago, right? It's like it's the accent, it's the way, there's a certain way of speaking, or it's the street sound, it's Obama's his first campaign manager, who's just like as Chicago as they get, right? Some of it is just about the people who are so clearly connected to the place and letting their voices, take center stage in the podcast. But the other thing we did with making Obama that I think really helped establish Chicago as a character was the second episode in the series where we talk about Harold Washington. He was the first Black mayor of Chicago. And in that episode, Colin did an amazing job of weaving together all of this historical tape of Harold Washington, Mayor Daley, Jane Byrne, these political characters, but also tape of some of the angst and the strife that was happening in the city. And you get this very clear picture of the city at that time in history when Harold Washington became mayor. And I think any people who listen, like, we got so much feedback about that episode. And it's funny because it wasn't about Obama, like it wasn't about him, but it was really important to his development as a politician. But, that episode, I think, really more than almost anything else, really helped people understand the politics of Chicago and, issues around segregation in the city. But it really did take like this we had to take this kind of detour from what might have felt like the natural through line of the Obama story, but it gave us the opportunity to firmly establish Chicago as a character in his story. So I think, when you have those times, those opportunities to, have people who sound like the place, who really sound like the place, like those voices are amazing, when you can bring in even references to places that people outside of the city may not be super familiar with, but that are really strongly identified with that place. Anytime you have that chance to bring in that kind of sound, that's a really good way of doing it. But again, I think so much for me, I mean, the human voice for me is such a powerful tool. And having people who sound like a place, I just think it can paint a really clear picture of a city or, a state or a country, in a way that just talking about it can't do. And then asking people how they describe the city, how they describe the place, how they describe the thing. And rather than you trying to explain it to people, let the people who are from that place do it. And the way they describe it will be so much richer and more true than anything you could do as someone, like as an observer from the outside in.
Nikki, you have a follow-up question? Jump on in.
Can I do another? Is that okay? Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay.
I'll see if
Yeah, I just have one more. I noticed when I was looking for the podcast that the way that it was released was that it was by season. And so the art for the show and the name of the show changes every season. Can you talk through, I feel like maybe it makes it a little bit difficult to go back and discover the podcast after. Can you just talk through that decision?
Yeah, and this is a place where I was not involved deeply in that decision, so it's a little harder for me to talk about it. But what I think I remember was that they wanted to keep the people who were already subscribed. So if people were subscribed to making Oprah, rather than starting a podcast that was sort of adjacent to that and hoping people migrated over, to just drop the next podcast in that same feed where those subscribers already were, so that we could build on the audience that was there already rather than trying to start from scratch and migrating people over from one podcast to another. I think that was a lot of the thinking behind it.
Got it. That makes sense.
If there aren't other questions, I'll jump in, Becca, but only if there aren't other ones.
I see Lauren.
Hi, Jen. Thank you so much. This was really wonderful. I used to live in Chicago, so it's like nice to at the same time as you're talking, because I'm used to just like listening to your voice. So this has been really neat. And I also wanted to say my parents are older and they don't listen to many podcasts, and I introduced them to Making Obama and they just loved the whole series. So I felt like it was like for regular public radio listeners to like, a good, like, it's like, this is what it can be. Anyhow, so thank you for that. And also I just wanted to hear a little more about your jump from major gifts officer into a producer and like your early days in radio. And because like the title of the workshop, the webinar, whatever we want to call this, is like making it happen. So I'm curious about how you made that happen. And also maybe some times where it felt like it wasn't happening, and how you sort of pep talked yourself or what you did in those times.
Yeah. So it's funny, like I've held just about every job in public broadcasting. I've never called myself a producer, because to me, being a producer is a very specific skill set. I'm a host, I'm a journalist, but producers to me are like, y'all is a different breed, and I love you so much. They are like I tell people all the time, you know, doing live radio is like walking a tightrope that somebody occasionally skips over and lights on fire. And producers are the net. Like producers are the people who are like, we are not going to let you hit the ground. We got you. So, but when I started in '99, part of it was just kind of making myself available to opportunity. And I was fortunate in that there were people around me who, I mean, and this is not an experience everybody has in public radio. I was very, 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 very fortunate. But there were people around me who were willing to mentor me, and who were willing to open doors of opportunity to me so that I could get the experience that I needed and that I really wanted. The other really interesting thing that happened was, like, I started off in major gifts, but I ended up after a few years managing the public television station that the university had at that time. And being in that management position gave me the opportunity to kind of learn how all of the pieces fit together. And so the thing that I'm really grateful for about my experience is that because I worked on the other side first, I got a really good grounding in how the marketing fits in with the fundraising, fits into what happens on air, and how those pieces kind of have to work together to make it all work. So I got this other education that I was able to carry with me that's really been beneficial. And then when I was about mid-career, the university had sold the television station, and I had started doing on-air work well, I'd been doing like documentary work on the radio side, and I'd been doing on-air work on the television side, hosting, doing some reporting projects and things like that. And then the opportunity to move back to radio opened up. And so I moved back to radio, and I was really more focused on taking what we were doing on air and building in the community engagement part of it. So like, how do we move this conversation we had on air to a conversation that we're having in community? And so that got me plugged into all of these other networks, which was really cool too, and helped me hone some skills around just moderating events and things like that, which also is, comes into play later on in my career again. So it's this really weird puzzle piece that worked together. But through that time, I was able to work with people in our newsroom and get coached and learn about, learn news judgment and learn like all the stuff that people would typically learn in J school. I got to learn in the newsroom. And again, this has not been, sadly, the experience of a lot of my colleagues in public radio, especially colleagues of color. I was really, really lucky. I was really, really lucky. I came across some cool people who just like opened doors and mentored me. And I'm enormously grateful for that. And so when the door opened for me for the All Things Considered position at Michigan Radio, the then host Charity Nebby was moving, and she was like, "Look, this is it. Like this is your shot. You should throw your hat in the ring." And I was like, "They're not going to give it to me." And she was like, "Just like try." And I did, and I applied for it, and I got the job, much to my shock and amazement. And so that felt like, even though I had been doing on-air work on radio and TV, that really felt like I'm really doing it now. Like I'm a public radio person. Like that's when it got real for me. And so I was there for another 6 years roughly, before we moved to Chicago. And we were in Chicago for 4 years, and now I'm in DC. So it was just sort of like, it got hard sometimes because I felt like I knew what my purpose was. And so often I was responding to the organizational need. Like, Jenn, we need you to do this. And I never said no. Jenn, we need you to do this. And I would say, okay, yep, I'll do that. And I would do that, and while trying to cobble together this other thing at the same time, right? But then there was this moment when the organizational need and my professional need and desire aligned. And even though I was like, wait, is this really happening? Is it? I think it's happening. And I went on and took that leap, and I haven't looked back. So it took a good eight years of the building blocks. I think it was roughly 8 years of the building blocks, but 8 years out of 20 plus, with everything else I learned along the way, I'm cool with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Mhm.
All right, well, we're gonna wrap up with Kat. One more question.
Yes.
I'll unmute myself. Thank you so much, Jen. That was amazing. And I'm so delighted that we're gonna have the chance. Sorry, that's my dog. I'm so delighted. I'm so Mizu? Not right now. I'm so delighted that we're going to have the chance.
I've got two. They're both with their grandmother right now. I understand. Carry on. One of mine is very vocal too. You're fine.
We're working on it. She's getting better. She's listening. I'm so excited. We're going to have the chance to have you again tomorrow with our incubator folks. So just amazing. But in the vein, kind of where they're at right now, I do want to bring out some of, I think, a challenge that all of us face. Whether you're producing a short docuseries that's maybe 3 to 4 episodes, or you're doing a much longer run, I'd love for you to speak through how you got through a time of just getting stuck, because that's where we're at right now. I think like they're just in the middle of starting to produce their first pieces. And I remember last year when we were here, this happened a lot where people were like, okay, how do I break through?
Yeah, I mean, and this is not specific to just podcasts. This is like in life. This is life. This is, just trying to work up the interview for the next day. For me, when I get stuck, what's really important, first thing is just like taking my hands off of it for a good minute. Just taking a step back, because I think when we're in it and we're attached to it, it's so easy to lose all perspective. It's so easy to even forget like why we're doing it in the first place. It's like, I'm not having fun anymore. I don't want to do this anymore. Why did I ever think this was a good idea? That's a really good time to just press pause for a minute and take a step back. And I'm not talking about like 10 minutes. I'm talking about like days. You might need to step back for days and just breathe and let whatever it is that is hung up for you in the back of your head, let it work itself out. Let it work itself out. Because I've had these times when I'm really struggling with something, and just even taking 24 hours, like I'll wake up in the morning with the answer. Like I will literally wake up and be like, oh, well, duh, and just go do it. But it's like our brains we get tangled up. We get tangled up in our own thinking, and you gotta give yourself some space from it. The other thing that I really recommend is, again, tapping into the network that you have, because sometimes you just can't hear it anymore. Like you're just too close to it. You're too close. Have a trusted person or 2 or 3 when it's not working and you can't get over the hump, and they've got to be somebody you trust, because it means you actually have to listen and hand it over and say, like, I'm stuck, help me get out of it. But the trust is important, because like if you've lost sight of it and they come back and they say, well, the fact is that you need to cut this thing, but you're super attached to it, like actually trust them and try it and see if it works. Because if you're close to it and everything is precious and everything is, I spent so much time like doing this thing, and now you want me to cut? Yeah, sometimes you got to cut it. But sometimes you can't make that call yourself. And it's really hard, because you worked really hard on it and it feels important and it all feels, it's yours, right? But this is that place where it's important to have people who you can trust your baby with for a minute to help you get out of that rut. But first, just take a break. Like honestly, just take a break. Listen to something else, listen to some music, go for a walk, let it breathe for a good 24 hours, and then come back and see if it's different. So those are like the two things that I always recommend. And like, and sometimes it's also useful to just talk it out with somebody. You know, that's something else that I do is again, this is why I love producers being like, look, I'm trying to craft this conversation. It is not flowing. Can we just talk it out? Talk it out and see if you can come out of it the other way. Just having that other person to bounce back what you're saying to you and telling you what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And as somebody who's like listening to say, it feels like that's a little soft, try, but if you did this there, that can be helpful too. Yeah. Yeah. And be gentle with yourselves, please. Like that's just the other like basic life rule. Just be gentle with yourselves. You know, what you're doing is important and it matters, but it doesn't matter more than you being okay. It doesn't. It doesn't matter more than you sleeping at night or you having lunch or you getting like 30 minutes of sun so that you remember there's a sun outside. It doesn't matter more than that. So be really gentle with yourself and make sure you're taking care of yourself because it doesn't happen if you're not okay. And I think sometimes we all just need to be reminded of that.
Yes, thank you for that reminder. We've been so aware that we're inviting folks into this challenge during a time where the world is changing daily, weekly, right? And to ask us all to be creative must be paired with the ask to be gentle.
Yeah.
There's so
do.
little that we have much control over right now. So many things going on. Well, thank you so much. We're going to let you go get some rest because you are doing beautiful, important work with NPR 1A. So thank you, Jen. Everyone, you can turn on your mic and say goodbye and thank you, and we'll close out here.
Yay!
Bye, everybody.
So
Bye, everybody. And I look forward to seeing faces tomorrow and hearing some incredible work. It's going to be fun.
Yay!
Okay, everybody.
Take care, everyone.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.